Okay, so just a few words about thinking, the chapter thinking, which is the first of the seven sins. And it's really a chapter about what is theoretically called metacognition, which is thinking about thinking, thinking about thinking. There's a lovely quotation by the artificial intelligence theorist Marvin Minsky, and it's beautiful. He says, "You cannot think about thinking without thinking about something." And that something often happens to be chess. In other words, chess can really help us understand our own minds. And indeed, it often is. A lot of cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience and so forth use chess because it's this controlled environment where you see how the mind works. So in this chapter, what I was really trying to do was to show that thinking, although it can be powerful and although it's necessary and although it's something that chess is defined by, it's not always very well understood by chess players. We take it for granted. We just think, the brain sort of switches on and off you go. But really, it's more like, I'm making the metaphors up on the spot here, but it feels more like, driving a car where you have a steering wheel and a gear stick and windows to look out of and go up and down on the accelerator and check who's in the back seat. The thinking is not just that it automatically goes on. There's a sense in which you're in control of the thinking and you have different aspects of the thinking to call upon. So there's a relationship between thinking and perception, and that's complicated, but how we perceive is about pattern recognition. It's about familiar clusters of meaning like castle kings and central control and pins and forks and skewers and pawn promotions and structures. That's the kind of apparatus by which we look at a position and it means something to us. Just as we look at a text and we see lots of words and sentences and paragraphs, in the same way we look at a position and we see those kind of patterns. So the first thing, one of the examples I want to look at is the nature of pattern recognition, how it works and how it doesn't work. I also want to speak a bit about intuition. Intuition's a somewhat mystical notion sometimes, but actually, I think in the book, I may have written it differently where I should write it today, but I speak about accessing your intuition as if it's always a good thing. It's not quite like that, because the stronger the player, the more effective their intuition is. If you're a beginner, you may have an intuition that something's right, but it could be completely wrong. What's truer and what I'm trying to get at is that in addition to the sort of working knowledge you have and the sort of things you remember and the things that are very clear to you, you do have also a lot of resources that are a bit less tangible, a bit more sort of latent, and that need to be sort of brought to the surface. Resources that if you're discerning about it and judicious about it, you can come to use better. And that's about asking the right questions of a position. In fact, to be honest, knowing how to ask the right questions of a position is a big part of what it is to be a strong player. There's no shortcut to that. There's no checklist. There's no rule book. In fact, another thing in this chapter is I speak about the problem of rules and the need to understand lots of chess rules. Things like get your knights out before your bishops, or castle early, or don't move your queen too many times in the opening. All of these rules have exceptions, and you see lots of great players breaking them. But there's something about expertise that's, you need to know the rules well enough to know when and how to break them. And therefore, for beginners and players that are not yet at sort of international or standards or beyond that, they need to learn basic principles of chess, but to hold them a little bit lightly too, not to get too attached to them. So in addition to pattern recognition and intuition, I also have a section in what follows about humor, which I think is an underappreciated feature of playing chess well. A lot of the way things go wrong, and I also cover this in the chapter, is to do with analogies that don't always work. So we think one position is like another position, and that often goes wrong because chess is very particular. A tiny detail, a pawn here, a piece there, a slight variation on what we expect, and everything changes. So that's why it's so hard to apply general principles, because every position is often maddeningly specific. And that's what makes it difficult to acquire expertise. It's all about context and attention and the underlying dynamics of that move in particular, that position in particular. And that's why humor is so important, because humor, if you think about it, is not something that you can easily replicate. You do get canned jokes, of course, and you get things that make people laugh again and again. But by and large, much of humor is about drawing attention to something that's shared experience, something that's happening in and of the moment. And it's often about a sense of proportion, and it's sometimes about dashing expectations in a certain way, observing things more keenly. All of these things are relevant to chess. So in what follows, we're going to look a bit about pattern recognition, a little bit on intuition, particularly with regard to talking to your pieces and what that means, and a little bit about humor. And there's more going on in the chapter in thinking, but that's enough for these videos to give you a flavor of what I mean when I say thinking can be thought of as a sin. Not that it's wrong, but that because it's flawed and because it has certain constraints, it can give rise to error. And by understanding that, you can work around it to try and find ways of playing better with the constraints that we have. So that's the thinking chapter, and let's go for it. So I love this example. It's the first major chess example in the book. And why do I love it quite so much? Well, it's surprising, and we'll see why in a moment. But it's also very elegant. It's quite beautiful. But the real reason I love it is because of what it illustrates about pattern recognition and how it works. Because pattern recognition is, as I mentioned, a really important feature of chess understanding. The way a grandmaster sees a position is quite different from the way an amateur sees it, because a grandmaster has been sort of primed over many years of pattern assimilation. And by pattern, we really just mean a kind of cluster of information, a sort of meaningful constellation of pieces. So a castled king position would be a pattern you're familiar with. A basic fianchettoed castled king position, a slightly more complex one with the knight on, for example, f3 and bishop on g2 and castled king, that would be a sort of known position, right? The center is a concept in a pattern. The relationship between pieces has a certain pattern. There are tactical patterns and strategic patterns. A lot of them are based on pawn structure. And one way of thinking of it is it's a kind of conceptual grammar, to put it in a grand way. And by that I mean, just as to speak a language, you need certain idioms and phrases that make sense, and words that follow one after the other, like that sentence I just spoke. Likewise, in chess, there are things that fit together and mean something. And what it is to be a really strong player is to have acquired a colossal number of those, and have acquired them in such a way that when you see the position, you no longer have to sort of consciously strain to see them. They're just there already. In the same way that I can speak about a park and a bike and a house, and it's not as though I'm straining to sort of picture how big is the house, what color is the bike, or anything like that. It's just that I've got some sense of what it means. In the same way with chess, pattern recognition is about things that we've absorbed over the years and decades that sort of infiltrate our consciousness and give us a certain perception of what's happening on the board. Okay, so that's what we mean by pattern recognition. And that's why I love this example, because it shows what it is and what it isn't really well. Not just this example, but also the commentary on it and the other example that speaks to it. But let's look at the position, which is a relief after all those words. What do we see? Well, I wonder what you see. I don't know who you are, where you are, how distracted you are, but what goes on in your mind? What are the key features? You might quite quickly notice something about the pawn structure. That's often a good place to start. What are the pawns telling me? Well, there's a protected passed pawn on e5, rather powerful and important fellow, that one. There's a rather, let's say, what's sometimes called a bad bishop. Bad not because it's naughty or misbehaved, but because it's restricted by its own pawns. As we see here, it sort of lacks a certain amount of scope. So you might see that. You might also notice that the pawn on d5 is possibly a little weak, just to sort of highlight that. And then I suspect you might also notice a sort of target here on f5, and that would be a normal thing to see. And you probably would consider bishop h3 as an option to attack this pawn. And you might consider g4 at some point as a pawn break. And you probably notice the queen here and wonder what's she doing out there. And with all those things in mind, you begin to form a perception of what's happening in the position. And you might wonder what to do. So come back without any of the insignia on the board and look at it again and think, what do I do? It's white to move here, and white is Eduardo Rosenthalis, whom I've met. I don't think I've ever played him, but I did when I was writing the book find his email address and ask him about this particular game, to figure out how he came up with what comes next. Because this is quite an important thing to understand about chess. Sometimes a game can look like it was all sort of planned in some grand conception. At this moment, the grandmaster playing white saw in a great epiphany exactly how the position should unfold, with a grandiose maneuver and the fireworks that followed. No, very often in chess it's one move at a time, and with hindsight it looks like this big flowing river, but actually when you look at it, it's really one step at a time, and that's what happened here with Rosenthalis. So the first move is maybe not that surprising, because if you ask yourself what black's up to, and that's always a good question to ask when you don't know what to do yourself, sometimes you can figure it out by asking, well, what does the opponent want to do, and can I do anything about that while I figure out what I'm doing? And I think it's clear that if white, for example, plays king h2 or does nothing in particular, black will probably want to advance on the queen side, right? And maybe either eliminate potential weaknesses or create weaknesses in white's camp. And it's certainly something to be going on with black. In fact, it's a clearer plan in some ways than anything white has at the moment. So what's white going to do? Well, Rosenthalis thought, well, let me start by stopping b5. He played a4. Slightly dissonant in the sense that the queen on h5 and the pawn on a4 feel quite far apart. There's something a little bit stretchy about white's position. On the other hand, it has a very clear purpose and it fulfills a function.